really good to be here again. Hi, everyone. I see there's lots of folks from all different parts of the world. I'm joining from Melbourne on Wurundjeri land, and I'd just like to second the really meaningful sentiment that Philippa shared. I've lived in this part of the world on and off for many years, and feel very grateful to live somewhere with such a rich history. So, second event of the series, really excited to kick off. I think we had what was an absolutely wonderful first event with Sophia Falk from the University of Bonn, sort of talking about the relationship between AI's materiality, inherent materiality, and its impact on planetary boundaries. And that was wonderful. Sophia did an absolutely excellent job of articulating really complex research areas. With that, we're into the next event. Small topic, AI and democracy. Claudia, it's really fantastic to be here with you. I've followed DemocracyNext work for quite a while, but this is the first time we've actually been able to chat. So thank you so much for agreeing to be here with us. I would prefer not to attempt to introduce you, but it would be really wonderful if you could, just give the folks a high-level overview of who you are, where you're coming from, and what you're working on at the moment.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you, Nate. Thanks, Philippa, for having me here today, and thanks everyone for joining. Nice to meet a lot of new faces, and I recognize a few people as well. So, hey, everybody. I'm joining you here from Amsterdam, where I live. I'm from Canada originally, and I have been working on questions of what can be called democratic innovation for the past 15 years or so. My initial entry point into doing this work was research that I was doing on populism, wanting to understand the extent to which people's disillusionment with politics and the system and feeling a lack of voice and agency in shaping decisions affecting their lives has been driving people towards different populist parties and actors, and becoming quite convinced from that work that it's not the only thing, because it's a complex phenomenon, but that political dimension really matters. And so finding meaningful ways to give people voice and agency in shaping decisions affecting them has become the central question guiding my work in all sorts of different ways, with many other sub-questions along the way. So I've worked at a few think tanks. I've written a few books on these questions. I had worked at the OECD, where I led the work on the future of democracy and innovative citizen participation. And in 2022, I founded DemocracyNext, which is an international research and action institute, which focuses on broadening who has power and how can we improve collective decision-making with these principles that underpin things like citizens' assemblies, meaning the random selection of decision makers, sortition being the word for that, deliberation, which I think we'll talk a bit more in particular about today, and also rotation of power. And so we do both kind of research work that's very practically oriented about how could you be applying different things that can actually scale these ideas, and we'll talk about some of that today. But we also have partnered with different organizations, government, but also museums and universities and cooperatives and others who have been wanting to kind of change how they do governance and decision making with these principles, and then doing research on that to understand and share the learnings back out. So looking forward to the conversation today about how AI intersects with all of that.
Amazing, impressive CV, Claudia. Thank you. That was a great overview. Look, so it's always hard. Like, how do you create a good foundation for something like this? We've got approximately, I think, Philippa, 20 to 30 minutes maybe of dialogue, and then as much audience participation as we can get through, and hopefully that format works well. I wanted to sort of go back to basics, if we could, just to get on a firm footing, and perhaps also somewhat selfishly for myself to sort of understand like how you might frame something like this. So if I were to say, like, what do you actually mean by democracy, Claudia? Like, how would you respond to that?
I think that's a good starting point because I think today democracy has also come to be associated with elections, as though those two things kind of mean the same thing. But actually, elections are just one form in which a manifestation of democracy can take place. And actually, at its kind of simpler heart, democracy is just a form of government where power is vested in people. And so the dominant conceptions of how that actually happens have changed over time. And ultimately, it's about people having equal power to shape the decisions that are affecting their lives.
Yeah, 2,500 odd years of tumultuous history there, right? Lots of experiments, lots of challenges, lots of experiments, lots of challenges right now. So let's get into sort of deliberation reasonably quickly. So I, in a lot of the work that I do, think about ethics as sort of like this deliberative process. And I know that you do a lot of work on deliberative democracies. To extend on the foundation that you've helped establish, where, folks that belong to a particular context equitably participate in decisions that affect their lives. Like how does deliberative democracy work, and what does it really mean?
Yeah, so I guess maybe starting with what is deliberation, because I think that's also a word I've come to really know that not everyone's even familiar with, and we don't always have the chance to practice it in a culture that's much more focused, I think, around debate. So deliberation really just means collectively weighing evidence with a goal of coming to a shared decision off the back of it. So that's also what makes it different to coming together for a dialogue, where we might be coming just to talk about things, which has a great value in itself. But in a deliberation, the goal is actually to reach a shared decision off the back of that. So, but I think the other part that we sometimes forget to talk about, that is not just about reviewing facts, that it also has to do with articulating what are our values, what are our emotions in relation to our understanding of what's going on in the world. So it's also not just that mere aggregation of people's views. It's really that process where people are giving reasons, justifications for what they're thinking, for what they want to see happen, for collective actions, and then also people attentively and respectfully listening to others. And if we extend that then to what is deliberative democracy, if we're basing it around that kind of basis of deliberation, it's a kind of, I guess, democratic or normative ideal, which is based around the notion that, democracy should be about people coming together and on the basis of having that equal status, the mutual respect that I was just talking about, coming together to discuss issues that they face, and on the basis of those discussions, deciding on policies that will affect their lives together. And so this tends to kind of be manifested in processes or things like citizens' assemblies or citizens' juries. The academics will talk about deliberative mini-publics. Basically, this means that there are groups of people who are randomly selected to be broadly representative of the diversity of the community in which they're part of. And then they have the time through a structured process to kind of do all those things that I just described.
Yeah, that was fantastic. I really like the fact that you started by sort of teasing out the differences between debate, dialogue, and deliberation. I think we live in a very debate-heavy culture, and debate sort of literally means to beat down the other, if you will. And if that's your starting point, it's hard to sort of healthily explore different territories and find pathways forward. So I really appreciate that. Now, I suppose one of the things that is coming to mind for me, Claudia, is gosh, there's so many directions I feel like I'd like to go. This is always challenging on these big topics. But okay, so one of the papers that I've read from DemocracyNext, I think you were probably the lead author, was really about how deliberation should inform AI governance. And I'm thinking that, we could go down a couple of different paths, and of course they're related. The ways in which AI can inform deliberation, and the ways in which deliberation can inform the development and use of AI. And I'm happy to choose your own journey. Like if we were to start sort of exploring that territory a little bit, where would you like to lead us?
Well, I mean, yeah, as you say, those are two different questions in a way. I've been thinking about both, so I'm quite happy to expand a bit on one or the other. I've done more work, or I'm maybe doing more on how AI can be used in deliberative processes, but I also equally am kind of interested in, and I think that whole debate and question around where does public deliberation come in on AI governance is a really important one. So I've given a few talks on this, and indeed,
Well,
so I'm happy to kind of go with what you think will be of
yeah.
interest.
No, well, let's go down the path that you're most familiar with. I think that would be, and if we have time, we can explore the
Sure.
other, and the other is particularly relevant to my work. But yeah, I'd love to explore the research, the thinking, the reasoning, future positions that you're sort of taking, and where Democracy Next is trying to sort of lead us.
Mm. Yeah, well, that gives a lot of free rein to talk about the things that I want to. I mean, I guess maybe a useful starting point for that is, I don't know, I guess there's like an interrelated set of questions when we're thinking about where does the intersection of AI and technology come in. And the way that I've been experiencing has been mostly through the kind of questions around scaling deliberation and scaling deliberative democracy, or forms of this in different ways. And so, but at the same time, one of the things that I've noticed, and some of my colleagues have noticed, is that question about scaling has been happening without people really actually defining what they even mean by scale. And so this was the starting point for a paper that I co-wrote with Sammy McKinney, who is a fellow at Democracy Next and is also a PhD candidate at Cambridge working on AI and deliberation right now. And so we wrote a paper on 5 dimensions of scaling democratic deliberation that seeks to offer just a bit more nuance on, what do we mean by scale? And also like, why is this valuable? And then with each dimension, where does AI intersect with that? And how could it be potentially useful? So I think it kind of just expands our abilities to think with a bit more complexity and nuance about what's possible. So those 5 dimensions that we talk about relate to scaling up, out, across, deep, and in. So to kind of briefly describe what I mean, and then I'm happy to elaborate on stuff that of more interest, but the high level kind of overview of that thinking is that scaling up relates to, I think, the notion of what most people tend to maybe intuitively think of as scaling, of like, how do we get more people deliberating? And that could be either within one process, or how do we just have like more people and more processes in general, like participating in a deliberation. Scaling out refers to that's what scaling out refers to. Scaling up is when we're thinking about how could we actually bring deliberation to higher levels of governance. So how could we think about it at a global level, for example? Scaling across refers to the idea of how can we be scaling the use of deliberative processes across like many different places, many institutions. So let's say like across to many different municipalities in the same country, across to universities and schools and workplaces and museums and other kinds of institutions as well. Scaling deep refers to how can we scale like and ensure that there's greater impact with any deliberative process happening. So this kind of connects to a lot of the work that's been happening in the field around what gets called institutionalization, which I admit is a mouthful, but the work around kind of establishing deliberative processes really as new institutions that therefore have a legal basis, that have more power, that are connected with institutions of electoral representation, of public administrations, and so on. And then the last one is around scaling in, which refers to really doing more work to enhance the quality of deliberative processes with a goal of therefore that increasing legitimacy, trustworthiness, trust in the process, and the kind of quality of the deliberation that has taken place. I admit scaling in was hard to think of what's the best way to frame this, but scaling in is the way that we thought of it. And so that kind of gives the overview. And then when you look, and they're not mutually exclusive. And then when you look at each of those, you can think, but actually AI applications can be applied in very different ways to help achieve some of these different goals.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. And I thankfully did read that paper before we jumped on the call, which was very helpful. There's a couple of things that I'd like to explore with you here, Claudia. So one of them relates to the sort of quality of deliberation and the skills or tools. Like, let's start with perhaps skills that a diverse sample of folks might need to learn and practice in order to engage in whatever high quality deliberation means in a given context. Can you share a little about, your thinking on that? Like what are these skills and how do we support people in, cultivating them? What is the right context? Yeah, I'm really, really interested in diving into that for a moment.
Yeah, indeed. Well, so I think that's a great question to be starting with, because I think if you put yourself in the shoes of someone who might be entering into a space of a deliberation or a deliberative process, especially if it's one where people have been selected by sortition, meaning a lottery process. So it's not people who are just used to going to conferences and university lectures all the time and like love coming and participating in maybe these kinds of events. There's really a much greater diversity of people who have different experiences, different levels of feeling comfortable in these kinds of spaces as well. So some of the most important work actually at the beginning of these deliberative processes is trying to create the kind of environment in which everyone feels comfortable and is capable and able to really bring forth their abilities into this space. And so there's work that's done about helping people think through about critical thinking and what does this entail, how to ask good questions, also work for, just time even for people to get to know one another in a slightly more informal and then the formal context as well. So actually in the academic literature, this gets called group building. And it shows that group building is actually the most important factor in determining people's ability to grapple with the complexity of what's going to happen in the deliberative process as well. And that's by extension of the fact that people start to build some trust with one another. They feel more comfortable. They're then able to ask questions, admit they don't know everything. And so it helps with creating those conditions and the context in which people are able to deliberate. Then other things relate to also, there's usually a moment where people will set some of the rules that will guide their deliberation. And quite often this is the same in most places, but there's actually something powerful about people deciding it themselves that has to do with like really listening to one another, being respectful, which again might seem kind of simple or common sense, but we're also in so many contexts and situations where those rules are just not actually applied. So I think there's a whole kind of setup of like the conditions that are then enabling for a deliberation to take place. And I think the last aspect maybe to emphasize or talk about is I'm a believer also in kind of the importance of having skilled facilitation in a deliberative space as well, because there will just also always inevitably be some people who do end up dominating or some people who might need a bit of extra support or help to come in. And I think with anyone who's ever also kind of moderated any form of group discussion, you understand too that it really is a skill to kind of be paying attention a little bit to kind of everyone. And it doesn't necessarily mean everybody being timed to speak like 3 minutes each or something like this. It's a lot more nuanced than that. So anyways, I think that relates to some of the things people are working on in the AI space as well, in terms of thinking about what roles should AI or could AI help with or not, even if it may be possible and so on. So.
Yeah, and I'd love to get into that in just a minute, particularly given that AI has a longer history than perhaps the general public is aware of, and I'm talking pre-Dartmouth 56 sort of stuff. There's a whole mythology, and there are some great papers on this that still seems to be influencing the sort of thinking, at least in different areas. But before getting into sort of the AI-aided component of these processes, how much does context matter? And by context, I mean sort of like proximity to, say, a given issue. So, like if let's take an example. So let's say it's something at a relatively sort of high level, like the state of Victoria here in Australia. Like, so it's a significant issue and it's something that relates to the state. like it makes a lot of sense to me that if you're in a like a very specific sort of bioregion, or like a local town, or like proximity like matters like terribly. But for something like that, where the issue is like larger than sort of like perhaps say our everyday lives or whatever, like what are the factors that seem to most influence people's capacity to usefully deliberate in a context like that? Or if it was happening at a nation state level, or in some potential future, like at the level of the UN, or like what sort of contextual knowledge do we need to bring to a deliberative process to be thoughtful, respectful, and effective participants in said deliberation?
Yeah, well, I guess your question makes me realize there's a couple elements I didn't emphasize in answering my last question as well, because I think the other two components
Covering a
also
lot of ground, so
yeah, to time, and then the breadth of information involved too. So I think there's debates about how much time is a minimum amount of time for a deliberative process, and that will depend on the context and the complexity of the issue that people are coming to discuss, obviously. But then I think, especially as like you're saying, there's different types of issues. Some are hyper local, where like people will have a lot, like everyone kind of will have some element maybe of a shared life experience in relation to that issue, and others might be more abstract or a bit more further away from people as well. And so it's also why a key component of these deliberation processes is time, that is also for shared learning, in terms of also, I think, especially in today's information environment, people having access to the same information around an issue, but also from a broad and larger amount of sources. And that can be a mix of kind of what we think of as from experts or from stakeholders or from academics, but also people who have life experience on this. And I think compounded with the fact that there's the benefit that comes from groups that are chosen by sortition, meaning random selection, with what gets called stratification. So that's just a technical word to ensure that this group is broadly representative of the diversity of a place. That also has a benefit actually for bringing forth the collective intelligence of that group, because people who will actually be coming from all sorts of different walks of life will also have different experiences in relation to that issue, which I think if you compare it to what tends to happen on a lot of big decisions today, there's much more homogeneity in who's involved in taking those decisions. If we're looking at either elected representatives or who might be in the civil service, or if there's a kind of expert high-level group that's formed for a commission or something like this, there's a great deal of research which shows that people from more diverse groups tend to come to better decisions because they have that much greater diversity of perspectives, experiences, are much more likely to bring forth novel ideas into the space. So I think that kind of relates to your question around like context, because I think actually when you also design to bring in diversity, it helps for the group to have a better understanding of the overall context as well.
Yeah, nice. That sort of opponent processing seems far more effective when participants are genuinely diverse, and that seems to be true of pretty much every context I've looked at. So that makes a heap of sense. I've just noticed, Dave, not hearing how AI can do that, just to mention that it might. So I'm reserving the last 10 minutes to sort of lead into, to kind of go in this direction. But that's a great prompt. Thanks, Dave. So like there's a couple of what I'd really love to cover in the next 9 minutes before we get into formally engaging with the audience is one, like what sort of forms of AI are being used in these contexts, and how. And I think that can get us into, so we can start there with sort of like categories of socio-technical systems and stuff like that. And then in the how, it would be really awesome if we could get into some practical examples. Yeah, like that and I'm sure that will take us probably at least that time. But maybe we start with, what types of systems are being used at the moment, Claudia? And are there some that are proving to be more efficacious in a certain direction, less efficacious in another? Like, is there a sense of that sort of landscape that you could perhaps give us?
Yeah, I mean, the time crunch is hard to cover all of the ground, but I think I'm unsure about the levels of awareness of the group of various things that are going on. But I think to try and I don't know, have a minimum same page and give a few examples of things that are less abstract. And it's also why I mentioned those 5 scaling dimensions, because there's different ways AI is being applied depending on what your goal is and what are you doing. And so there's been quite a lot of interest, for example, of people who have been interested in scaling out to many people and involving more people in a deliberation in testing things like, well, could we help to automate and have like AI facilitators? But then there's like a whole bunch of kind of built-in assumptions to some of those approaches as well. So one thing I didn't mention is that these deliberative processes can be in person or online only or hybrid. An element that I'm like is kind of central to the work that I'm doing though is like they're synchronous. So I kind of think a lot of the things that get called deliberation in the asynchronous kind of space are often not very deliberative if we go back to the definition of what we're talking about. So anyways, so you can have online only, hybrid or in person. Personally, I've been most interested in doing work on the like in-person space and also how AI can support that. But there's also lots that's been happening in the space of virtual only. So scaling out, more people in a deliberation, that tends to be assumed that this is going to take place in a virtual online setting where you might be able to then break people up into like many different breakout groups and still have small group conversations. But instead of a human doing that work of facilitating those, you might have an AI which is kind of trained to give out prompts at different moments of the conversation and so on. So personally, I've been a little bit skeptical about some of those kind of approaches in terms of going back to like, what are some of the problems we're trying to solve by doing this, in the sense of, I mean, first of all, I think facilitation itself is also a really valuable skill. And in like to your point, your question about skills earlier, I actually think more people should know how to facilitate conversations well. So is that something we want to kind of give to AI, or is it something that maybe we would want human facilitators to have some AI kind of prompts or training or help with the work that they're doing? From what I've seen in the space of kind of the AI facilitation, it tends to be also very heavily programmed in a sense of like, okay, like kind of 10 seconds or 30 seconds or whatever each person, and like once they get to the edge, like they're kind of almost cut off and it goes to the next person. But I think that's like also not very true to the flow of an actual conversation as well. So, and anyways, I think there's trade-offs. I think various things are being explored, but I also think we might be losing sight of the democratic dimension if we're thinking about this in the context also of democratic deliberation. Because I think one of the claims that goes along with like trying to do that or wanting to do it in the first place is like, well, it'll be way cheaper. But actually, it's only cheaper if you're not paying people also for their time to be part of these processes, which to me actually feels like one of the core components of when you're doing this also in the context of democratic deliberation and decision making. People should be paid for their time, and all sorts of other supports are in place. And actually, I think we also saw during COVID times where there was a bit of a natural experiment of things that were designed to be initially in person that got moved to being online only, where we realized that actually in many contexts where sortition was used, usually about a quarter of the group didn't have access to a computer at home that they could use for such a process as well. Not everyone like us uses Zoom all the time. Like people needed a lot of support even if they had computers and used them for other purposes or so on. So I think like if we're going down a route of thinking about like online only spaces, there's like a whole bunch of other democratic questions that get raised. So that's kind of one thing. But I think if I want to give a few other concrete examples, if we think about the dimension of scaling in, how could we use AI kind of technologies in different ways to be enhancing the quality of deliberation that's taking place? Again, this could be in an in-person or online setting. I'm excited by the kinds of tools like DemBrain, for example, or Deliberate or Cortico, and I can put a few links in, which again emphasize like the humans which are talking to one another, but those conversations that they're having being recorded, and the ability for LLMs to be parsing through large amounts of conversation data also in very short amount of time time could be something that can help develop outputs or visualizations that can help support the people that are in the deliberation. So not replacing the kind of deliberative work they're doing, but, you know, for example, I think one kind of problem in typical deliberation processes that is just a challenge is the fact that you're often going from having one large group conversation with, I don't know, 50, 100 people, but then you're splitting up into smaller groups to go into greater depth. And there's just always some form of richness that gets lost from all those small conversations, and typically some form of bias that gets introduced with whatever form of reporting back you choose, whether you kind of go group by group, whether someone has been assigned to report back on behalf of everyone, or if it's the facilitator or someone who's spoken, or you're just kind of randomly popcorning from across the room. Like, you're really getting a rather just like small sense of like what has actually taken place. So tools like Dembrain, for example, by recording each of those small group conversations and sharing back either in the form, again, of visualizations of like argument maps of like how, or idea maps of how the ideas people have been talking about in different places relate to one another, or kind of summaries that bring back really like the main kind of clusters of ideas that have happened, not as something that should be taken as like, this is like final and perfect, with a recognition that this is obviously not perfect, that like AIs are not perfect tools that can be helping this, but can we use that as a starting point to say like, okay, these are the clusters of things. Does this resonate with what you've talked about? Is there anything missing from this? And so on. So again, just thinking about how could you introduce things like that to be kind of overcoming some of the things that are challenging in a typical deliberation process. I think we're seeing kind of a greater variety of tools that are overcoming this. And I think maybe to end on the kind of a slightly more abstract point, but that I think helps to convey the point. I think the way that I'm thinking about this, and I'm working on an essay right now with Sammy McKinney and also Yoram Toons and Eugene Yee, that kind of talks about what are the normative goals of deliberative technology, the way that we see it. And one of our kind of sources of inspiration that has really resonated and stuck with us is a metaphor that the director of the Santa Fe Institute, David Krakauer, has made about complementary versus competitive AI tools for cognitive thought. And he gives the example of the abacus as a metaphor. So if you want to learn math better, there are either like complementary or competitive tools that can get you to like being able to do really complex math equations. So an example of a complementary tool is the abacus, where when you use it, you come to like develop this spatial reasoning. And if you take the abacus away after a period of time, you can still do that same reasoning without the need for the tool. So you've become way better at doing math thanks to it. And on the other hand, a competitive tool is the calculator. You're really great when you have it, but when someone takes it away, you can't do those same equations anymore. And I think that like there's a metaphor here about this is how I'm thinking, and how like some of us are thinking about deliberative technology and where does it fit in? How can we design it to be a complementary cognitive tool that it helps people develop those skills better, and when the tool is taken away, they can still be good deliberators, rather than something that's trying to replace some of those crucial kind of skills and work that people should be doing in it.
Yeah, great point. And that speaks to one of the other suggestions from Dave there. And I think we're seeing this all over the place, particularly I'm seeing it in particularly sort of like undergrad settings, like cognitive atrophy. A lot of professors are talking about. I don't know quite how much empirical literature we have really yet, but no, that was incredibly helpful. Okay, so we've started to get a few comments, questions, queries, concerns, etc., coming through. I think we've got a pretty good foundation, Philippa, to start the Q&A. Would you mind taking over and leading that process for us?
Sure, absolutely. And just to say, yeah, please keep those comments and questions coming. The first one came through from Philip. Philip Ward is the lead of the Sustainability Network, for anyone who doesn't know him. And he's asked, he said that he's interested rather in the way that AI can be used to undermine democracy. And he wondered if you had any thoughts that you could share around that, Claudia.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as with pretty much any technology, it can be used in ways that are positive or ways that are not. And I think at least in my role, I feel like the vast majority of the focus is actually on how AI is or can be undermining democracy, whether that's through impacts on the information environment or all sorts of other things. So I think that's where, like, that's not been the main focus also of my own work and research. I think I come at it through that lens of a skeptic, in the sense of kind of in relation to what I was just saying, kind of always also thinking about and asking, like, even if it might be theoretically possible to do something, we shouldn't lose sight of that question as well of, like, should we be doing that? And kind of, I guess, there's that broader point that I was just making specifically about deliberative technology, but I think you could extend that actually to the way that AI tools are being developed for all kinds of democratic processes. Is this something that is complementary or competitive to something that humans are good at or should be able to be doing? And I don't know. I think that AI is also just that kind of next layer to be thinking about. And the first thing we should also, though, be thinking about relates more to what are the democratic kind of institutions, structures, processes that we have in the first place, and then how does AI interact with those? And so that's also where kind of my thinking and focus has also been about how can we be evolving beyond an elections-based representative democracy being this monolithic sense of what democracy even is, because I think we're seeing the limits of those institutions and structures today. And, I mentioned that my initial entry point into all of this work was research on populism. Like, I really think the disillusionment that many people have with today's systems is really legitimate. And we should be working towards thinking about how do we actually evolve our institutions and architecture of democracy beyond what we have now, and then where does AI kind of fit into that in terms of it being used as something that is actually kind of positively helping in the direction of improving our collective decision making.
I might just very briefly add something to what you suggested, Claudia, Philippa, if that's okay. Phil, I think, it's such a challenging area. Like, obviously our epistemic landscape is all over the place, so that's a significant one. But I think there are a number of sort of wide boundary implications here, like the power dynamics, where power is concentrated with these tools is, I think, something that many scholars are looking at, and there are a bunch of concerns there. I think something that perhaps we explicated a wee bit a couple of weeks ago with Sophia Falk is that these systems are inherently material, and they are having a significant impact on planetary boundaries. And in fact, there are some scholars that are arguing that these, particularly these systems that we've seen sort of publicly available the last few years, can be potentially sort of force multipliers for underlying drivers of systemic dysfunction. And I think so taking, a more sort of, you see Dave Snowden on the call, like a more sort of complexity informed view to a lot of this is probably very helpful in sort of like structuring your units of analysis, if you will. But another one is like, democracy, like let's just say we look at planetary boundaries, and I don't want to obsess about this because, again, we touched on it a couple of weeks ago, but we've transgressed 7 of 9. It's very hard to know exactly what that's going to mean over the coming decades. But if we become increasingly resource constrained, this significant movement of climate refugees, there's all different types of resource power dynamics and potentially wars going on. It puts so much strain on, to Claudia's point, our deliberative processes. And so when you're looking at the impact of a given sort of like socio-technical system, you don't want to just look at first order impacts. You want to look at second and third. You want to look at indirect and systemic. And of course, they are harder to explore prior to the implementation of something, but it doesn't, just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't attempt that thinking. And perhaps there are ways through which diverse deliberative processes can be part of, attempting to explicate, an impact landscape over time. Anyways, just thought I'd add a couple of little brief comments in there, Phil.
You're right, Nate. I was actually going to ask, just because there are quite a few comments from Dave Snowden. Dave, would you like to say anything or add anything to the conversation? We'd love to hear your thoughts if you'd like to add them.
I was just about to type something. I think the real problem here is all of the deliberative democracy movements really derive from an Enlightenment concept of democracy. Yeah, and an assumption that you've got time for deliberation. So the next call I'm going on to is actually assessing the likelihood of civil war in America, where Putin will hit next, what happens when 65 million people die in one day of heat death, and how do we respond to that? Yeah, we're in a very different world, right? And the ability of social media to manipulate anything which is text-based is massive. And so if I look at the work we're doing at the moment, which is based, for example, on swarms, is to allow consultation of millions of people within 2 hours. Yeah, so that there's no time for social media manipulation of the environment. So I think, there's a huge amount we can do with all of this, but the minute we restrict ourselves to text, we restrict ourselves to 10% of what we know, and we privilege people who can write text which AI will pick up. Nobody's paying attention to training data sets. 50% of the internet is now AI generated, and the LLMs are training themselves off their own output with a perversion which comes from that. So I want to go back to Lincoln. Lincoln famously said in his speech to Congress, the best quote I've ever heard from a politician, everything is inadequate to the stormy present. As the times are anew, we must think anew and act anew. And that means the concept of time-based deliberation between actors is not sustainable in the modern world. We need to rethink democracy. Sorry, but you did ask. Sure.
I'm happy also
on this coming out shortly if anybody wants it.
Yeah, I personally respectfully disagree. Like, I think I don't think that that's insurmountable problem, in the sense that I actually think that also within our current systems that, again, rely on decision making through our government coalitions and people who are in elected office today, there are so many decisions that are stuck and there's just no action even being taken on them. And we see that. Yeah, but I'll just elaborate a little bit further. I don't think that there are different forms that deliberative processes can take. Different decisions also need different amounts of time. I don't think every decision needs a 5-day deliberation process on it either. But at the same time, I really contest the notion that we also don't have 5 days to deliberate on many different things that will have really huge societal impacts on lots of people. Like, to be quite frank, I personally would be really concerned if we're starting to take decisions based on consultations of millions of people who don't really know very much about a topic in 2 hours, and to just get their top of mind opinions on those complex issues. To me, there's a really big difference between aggregating people's top of mind notions of something versus having a more collective judgment emerge from some shared learning and discussion, and the harder work, I think, of figuring out where can we find some basis for agreement on this.
I'll make one comment, then I'll shut up. Yeah, that is not what we're talking about. You're talking about mass understanding of ideation patterns at scale. The idea that actually only a certain number of people are privileged to be capable of emerging in something is very different, right? You said earlier on in your presentation the criticality of facilitation. A process critical on good facilitation is not scalable and is not sustainable. And handing that over to AI is a problem. So there is a role for deliberation, there is a role for consultation, there is a role for sortation, but it's inadequate to the wider problems. Anything which takes 4 to 5 days in a modern age, if it's of significance politically, the bad actors will manipulate social media around that context. And that influences politicians and everybody else. And we have to address that problem. And we have to address the issue about the cognitive decline of AI, the fact that it makes it easier for people to make decisions and it's easier to manipulate. So there needs to be an active, let's talk about this. There needs to be a dialogue between those of us who are concerned about this, about those differences and how we manage that. But don't make assumptions about what, I'm trying not to make assumptions. I probably have. I would say the other way around.
Just to take us in a new direction, I'm seeing some comments come through around just building on those comments around the biases and values around AI, our next event is actually going to talk about that exact topic, the values inherent in AI systems. And we also will have an event coming up in the near future on misinformation and disinformation, which will explore at a greater level those topics as well. I'm just going to ask about, there was a question earlier around whether AI is being used to map voting patterns or voters. Here we go. It's from David Fernay. Have political parties been using AI to identify swing voters or marginal seats that were unknown by conventional means to better focus campaigns? I wonder, Claudia, has your research extended to any of these voting patterns at all?
No, so my work at the moment is not on that at all. I did used to work at a political consultancy where we did micro-targeting and focus groups and all sorts of other things. So it's also been a very long time that micro-targeting approaches have been kind of relying on massive data sets and various manipulations of that. I've not been in the weeds of those rooms of what is the latest ways in which those technologies have evolved, but I have no doubts that there are people who are probably working on that.
Thank you. And a question from Laurie around whether deliberation can aid in determining governance frameworks of society or government's use of AI. And I think this might relate to a paper that I read of yours around local, I think you called it globalism and localism around AI, regulation and framing.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to find the question to understand it a little bit better.
So I can read it exactly. He said he would like to hear how deliberation can aid in determining governance framework of society/government's use of AI, i.e. its masters a determining system, not for the broader social common good.
Yeah, indeed. I might find a link actually to like a longer piece which relates to like a half-hour talk that I gave on this, because I'm aware of it's a huge question. This was one of the two routes I think, Nate, you were thinking about going down in terms of like, you can also talk about deliberation for AI governance. And indeed, there's actually another paper that I've written with Stefan Verhulst, who's the director of NYU's GovLab, exploring the kind of the differences between approaches and thinking about AI globalism versus localism, in the sense that a lot of people, I think, given the kind of ubiquitous nature of AI being applied in many different countries, in different places, in different contexts, thinking that there's a need for having decision-making and regulation around AI at a global level, which is probably true to some extent, but also given the lack of teeth of governance institutions that exist at that level, there being no enforcement mechanisms at the UN or OECD or UNESCO that has also issued various guidelines. So I think it's been important that there has been various bits of work done there. But I also think that when it comes to some of the more concrete ways in which AI is actually being applied, whether that's for surveillance or policing or how it might be used in schools and all sorts of other things, those are actually quite often much more local applications. And I think the more that we can have deliberations at that level, which makes more sense and makes this notion of AI also less abstract to people, that was kind of one of the main premises of the argument. I mean, I'm kind of shortening it down. There's more detail in the paper that I'll put a link to. But I think to me, the main premise and why I really believe why we do need public deliberation around these issues, which might be rather technical in nature, is because they're not just technical dilemmas either. So there's a quote that I really like by the Nobel Prize winning physicist Richard Feynman in a speech that he gave when he was talking about his reflections on the atomic bomb and all the work around that too, which I'm paraphrasing. I can find the exact as well, but basically he's saying that the science can help determine okay, our understanding of if we do this will happen, but it cannot answer the question of should we do this? And that's where the need for public deliberation, which evaluates the different kind of routes that science is also suggesting, and technical experts might be suggesting these are the different possibilities, but like on its own, these are not values neutral questions. These are ultimately democratic dilemmas. And so the need for having a form of public deliberation, I think, is really essential. And I think we risk going down also a technocratic route on the other side of things, of thinking we can bypass that and that will be okay. I think if you believe in the values of democracy, I'm not okay with going down that route.
Might just add something super briefly. I know we're so close to being out of time, Claudia, but so one of the things that I do a lot of in my work is attempt to build participatory processes of ethical deliberation. And I'm not going to be able to say a lot about this. And it's not always super appetizing for different types of organizations, by the way, but I'm giving it a red hot crack. And it speaks to one of the points that we were speaking about earlier, Claudia, around skill. Like, one of the challenges that I have, particularly, philosophers tend to use language quite specifically. Wittgenstein once quipped, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. And that's a real challenge. So when we start talking about values, and let's just say we take, AI ethics principles. Here in Australia, we have 8. And they were published in 2019. They were based on a big body of work from IEEE, Ethically Aligned Design, which was approximately 700 folks. It's largely very good work. The Australian government did some consultation to encourage different forms of participation in that process. But when you say something like, even the first principle is like, about the value statement is basically, most of these things are broken down into sort of like a value, a principle, like an enactive statement, an action-oriented statement that's sort of verb-driven, and then there's some detail, right, that's supposed to guide folks to attempt to reflect on and then quote-unquote operationalize. One of the big challenges that we have with this sort of like value-sensitive design, or whatever we want to call it, or bringing ethics formally into these deliberative processes, is the language. And I'm just, this is a last little, this might be throwing a spanner in the works with 1 minute to go, but I'm wondering, have you seen any examples where AI systems have been used to help, do something like in metaphor theory, like sort of like conceptual blending or whatever it's called, where you help folks go like, there's this word, and we're going to help you understand what it means in a way that's relevant to you. And I'm wondering if that works that way, but I'm also wondering if you've seen examples, Claudia, of that used, with like people that speak just fundamentally different languages and come from different cultural lineages. In 30 seconds.
In 30 seconds, the short answer is no on that front. But I am interested in the ways that, like, we could be, like, that's precisely one of, I think, the potential positive ways we could think about how AI could be actually helping improve the quality of deliberations. And we've been involved in various multilingual deliberative contexts as well. And I think it is a real challenge, and especially if you're thinking about anything that's at higher levels of governance, like the EU's deliberative processes have been taking place all in 24 different languages. So to the kind of question about time, that also requires extra time usually to be dealing with translation and getting people understanding each other and so on. So the other part of the answer is I'm just really interested in seeing what can be done in a positive way in this space. Yeah, I'll stop there because I know we're at time. So thank you for having me and for organizing this discussion and for the very good questions that have emerged as well.